Of course, a very good afternoon those that are joining us from Europe, all our guests that are joining us from the US, all our guests that are joining us from South Africa, as well as the African continent. What an absolute pleasure it is to be in your company during this course as we try to navigate the way in which a business must really. Welcome to it. I cannot wait to have these conversations with you. You are, of course, tuned into the Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT, where we really are trying to have conversations around the shifting of leadership and navigating of times and how is it to grow in that regard, and also make sure that we grow in a way that materializes practically in the way that we conduct our everyday lives. My name, of course, is Faith Mangope, and I will be taking you through the procedure throughout the course of the 45 minutes that we've got together. We've got lots to get through, and we've got to talk a little bit also about how we can show up practically as leaders within the greater context of quite uncertain familiarity as well. I'm glad to see many of you joining in. I hear a little bit of a sort of a sound. It's like a little bit of a doorbell that rings as many of you are joining in, and fantastic. That's great. That means that you're all part of the conversation, and we're looking forward to actually hosting you and being able to navigate this issue around foresight. How do leaders actually show up in a time where foresight is needed to navigate part of uncertainty, and how do we do so in an authentic manner, in a practical manner, and in a manner that allows us to not only bring ourselves along for the journey, but those that are within the next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, as I specified, that I'll be hosting these series of sessions with you, and of course I am not alone this afternoon. I am joined by, I call it the woman that is going to take the initial hot seat. She's joining us this afternoon, Gina Schoeman, Managing Director of South Africa Economists and Head of and the head of South Africa Research, Citibank. Of course, she's got an accolade and a half, speaking to Gina's accolade, Managing Director at Citi and Head of Samea's Economics, South Africa Research and South Africa Economist. She has been at Citi since 2012, having started in London, and prior to this, of course, Gina was a lead economist at Barclays Capital, Absa Capital, and before then, Maguire and Standard Bank. Studying at the University of Cape Town, she is thoroughbred in South Africa Gibbs Business School, and of course, being consistently rated as top rated and local and global analyst rankings, who's passionate about mentoring young professionals and promoting gender equality. Gina, thank you so much for making yourself available for these sessions, for having the difficult conversations at the time that the country needs it most, and a very welcome to you.
Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I hope that our conversation is able to at least add a bit of color, a bit of light to what we're expecting ahead of us.
We definitely are going to be adding that color. And you know, Gina, more than anything else, it's about the notion of reflecting on what was said by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, during his financial and his budget speech. This was following, obviously, the State of the Nation address that was tabled by the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, navigating these uncharted waters. And I think that the Finance Minister had quite a difficult job to do in being able to alleviate and allay fears coming in from all different sectors of society, from interest groups, socio-economic interest groups, those social interest groups, business and the like. And it was really a difficult path in being able to find that fine balance between making money for the economy, generating capital, actually post-COVID economic recovery, and seeing how it materializes in a practical way. Your insights as you've navigated, and I know you, from even going through some of your readings, that you are a no-holds-bar individual when it comes to this assessments and this analysis, but your insights in terms of what was shared by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana.
Look, I would say this about not just our current Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, but, for the whole of National Treasury, the whole of the Finance Ministry. Wow, that leadership, that is a very difficult job, because you've got a lot of promises being made by one side of government, but you also have a purse that is literally, I wouldn't say shrinking, but slowing down at a rapid rate. We've come out of a few years now of lucky. When I say we were lucky to receive the commodity price cycle, we did. We weren't lucky enough, however, to create a conducive environment for investment. So all that money, all it did was we took it as corporate tax revenue, and we were able to pay for some things that we actually otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford. Treasury trying their best, and I always say this about Treasury, they squirrel money away to different places, almost because watching the way that they have to try balance all these trade-offs in government, you can see how worried they are about the consistent demands to spend more and spend more. However, spending has two channels. You either spend it on something for consumption, which usually has a very small multiply effect for the economy, but I can get back there, right? Let's not take that away entirely. But then you spend money on things that gives you something back. And that's where the investment arm lies, etc. So this is the difficulty, is that, I know that Treasury thought this would be a straight, forward budget, but then we get to the State of the Nation address. We get to the energy crisis, of course, that's now persisted. And believe me, this is the first time we've had an energy crisis persist. We've always had sporadic bouts of load shedding, and it is interesting watching behavior in this economy. Consumers kind of forgot about load shedding in between those sporadic phases, but no one's forgetting this time because it started in the middle of last year and it hasn't gone away. So naturally, with an economy that hasn't grown sufficiently for so long, and we're talking about more than a decade, and an economy that has effectively, by inequality standards, got poorer and more desperate, you naturally are going to see a party that is heading into an election that is desperate to remain above 50%. We believe you're going to see the first fiscal impulse, as we would call it, I'll define it for you, going into this election than we've ever seen before in South Africa, because in actual fact, the ANC's never been desperate. They've always won the elections quite easily. But now, of course, you've got people who are hungry. You've got people who have protested to a point where we had a horrendous event in 2021. You've got this energy crisis that is very inflationary, and we've come out of an inflation cycle. We're still peaking in it, coming off. So there is a lot at stake for this economy. And the State of the Nation address, what does it do? It gets announced that there are a couple of new things that Godongwana and his treasury are going to have to tweak going into that budget. So, for example, why can't we get a bit more realistic here? I understand from Treasury's negotiating perspective that they don't want to just roll the social relief of distress grant into perpetuity, because that would become the negotiating starting point. And it's currently unaffordable until they can find a permanent revenue stream for it. So they start off at ground zero by saying, well, we're going to have it for another year and then we're going to stop it. But that's not realistic. In the same way that, Treasury will present social grants in a last year's budget growing at only 2.5%. But in reality, not only is headline CPI in South Africa peaking around 8%, low-income individuals still have inflation in their baskets as of right now of over 10% year on year. So the social grant is actually not compensating for the price increases they're seeing on food and public transport. I mean, lives there are horrendous. So there's a huge humanitarian element here. But suddenly, because we've got a president who announces things, and I will say that, President Ramaphosa, he's done some reforms, but he knee-jerks a lot in his decisions. And sometimes they're not always the best thought-out plans. And so I give all credit to the Finance Ministry and National Treasury for always trying to balance off these trade-offs of, we don't have enough revenue, but we see you pushing more expenditure our way. And we've been saved a few times. I always say it's amazing. They managed to repackage, all of government's failures, repeatedly, year after year in some clever format. And they still have so much institutional strength that we haven't lost as many investors as we could as a result of that. We've also got some cushioning in our fiscal policy side, such as most of our government debt is local currency based, which is hugely comforting. We've got very long maturity profiles. So it's difficult for especially offshore investors to look at South Africa and expect a fiscal crisis that would happen very suddenly. But the writing on the wall tells us that until we can start growing again, revenue is going to dry up. And then I'll end here. More worryingly so, the tax base is at risk of shrinking because we're not fixing the economy and because we're seeing these waves of immigration of mostly high-income individuals out of the country.
Sure. And significantly so, it's about being prepared adequately for it. And I was just sharing with you that it seems as though South Africa and South Africans are in fear. Investors are in fear. Business people are in fear, and the fear is so tangible and it's practical. right? There have been reports, Gina, about a possibility of grid collapse. And nobody has almost had the foresight of how do we deal with a possibility of South Africa being in the dark for 2 days, 3 weeks on end. Now, we do not want to be the people that sell doomsday, but we want to be the people that are adequately prepared for what is to come in South Africa. Clearly, when it comes to the fiscal pressure, we've experienced it for a long period of time. The politics gets into the way of the economy. The politicians try to get elected and re-elected. 2024 is around the corner, and I think that we should all be very conscious of 2024. And certain policy decisions will be taken in the favor of the very same 2024, as well as favorable outcomes for the governing party. But at the back of that is the daily lived experience of business people, of leaders, of institutions, of corporate, who are just trying to get by and make money, not only for themselves, but those that are around them. How do you see us being able to have the foresight of planning, the realistic expectation and interpretation of where we are as a country? Because I don't want us to run away from it, right? We're at a place where possibility of grid collapse, unfortunately, is a big possibility. So how do we navigate these uncharted waters, unprecedented times where people are really in fear?
Yeah, that fear is real. I must say, in all my years of speaking about South Africa to various types of investors, from corporates to institutional investors who are on our bond market and our stock exchange, I've never actually seen as much concern. Unfortunately, also disinterest. Because we have literally cried wolf for so long. This time it's different. This time is different. This time is different. Whereas the only reason it's different this time is that South Africa has now introduced so many factors to be concerned about. When I used to speak to investors, let's say, even 3 years ago, top of that list was energy, of course, electricity. And everyone just said, fix Eskom and the rest will all fall in place. You'll attract investment. And if you do attract investment, that is the golden key, because if a real investment, and I don't mean to say that bond and, institutional investment, bonds and equities isn't, but bricks and mortar in the ground means that you're expanding in a multiplier effect, and you're not just expanding in capex, you're expanding in human capital. And that is obviously what we so desperately need. It once was 23% of GDP investment. It's now 13% of GDP. So you can see how much we've lost in this economy. The biggest concern, and then I'll get to how to potentially navigate this through, or some of the patterns I'm seeing across leadership, is that, yes, there was a things will get better attitude every time load shedding stopped and there was another plan put on the table. But as soon as load shedding got persistent last year, and there are some little shining lights, and there are so many puns when it comes to talking about electricity and energy, so please forgive me on all of those. But I'll get to the slight constructive element of all of this. But if you think about it this way, this time last year, we had just moved into an international war zone, effectively, and oil prices had escalated. It was the first time ever that our government, and I do think that was a correct decision, decided to subsidize the fuel price, much like so many other economies in the world. Because number one, they'd received revenues from commodity prices. But number two, what they did, and whether this is intentional or not, I still don't have a firm answer, but what you want to do on fuel in South Africa is stop the public transport prices from going up too quickly, because they're very sticky on the way down. And this is mostly our unregulated taxi industry. So that was that reaction. Then, of course, we had the rest of inflation going up, especially food prices. So you have that immediate shock. Then, of course, load shedding starts to get very severe from mid-year onwards. You have an energy crisis plan that's announced, makes everyone feel better. But then you go forward a few months, and next thing you know, you've got fala. You've got a president who is now leading this all, trying to resign. You then have the other complication of the actual CEO of Eskom under Director resigning with all sorts of allegations around, his safety, let's put it that way. We then move into an ANC election, right? Everyone wants to know, what does this mean for the top six? Then we come out of that, and where are we headed into? We headed into the most severe beginning of the year electricity crisis we have ever been in. all of the allegations, the groundbreaking interview we heard with Andre de Ruyter, more and more of the same. A president who's just not featuring, he's not seeing people, he's not taking, Q&A from journalists. And so there seems to be such an absence of leadership at a time where Treasury also has to make these huge decisions, like what to do with Eskom debt. If they hadn't found a solution to relieve Eskom of its debt, there would be no room for Eskom to have a credible plan in terms of operations. So where I'm getting to all of this is just, you can see how the leadership is so ultimately important for the credibility. Now, how do you navigate through all of that? Because people are terrified. I mean, load shedding is net inflationary. I have spoken to corporates that didn't just get hit by obviously the oil price last year, distribution costs going up. How do they not pass that on to consumers? But then they have to run generators for cold storage, for example. That adds another 5% to their operating costs. And now they're left, do we keep our profitability so we can basically keep our staff? Or do we not pass through to consumers, but now we have to start shedding something of ourselves, which is usually your wage bill or your investment intentions, but it gets down to the same thing. And so you need accountability. I think you need leadership that stands up and says, I've made a mistake. These have been the errors in our way, but this is how we're going to fix it. Or looking back and saying, the way we've gone about things hasn't worked. So we're actually going to take another step in another direction. I'll give you 2 examples. So the first one would be, can't we really start partnering up properly? Government balance sheet has nothing left in it. Government capacity has nothing left in it in terms of skills and almost economies of scale. The private sector does. And the private sector seems to be so keen to, if you look simply at self-generation as an example. The private sector is so keen to get involved in that space, and that is the constructive element coming out of all of this. That is one area where we are forcing together this partnership. On the other side of that, we've got a former CEO of Eskom who has now been forced, I would say, for no other reason other than to just tell his side of the story and the truth, to come out and expose everything that he saw from his side. There is one element there that perhaps de Ruyter forgot about. To make himself more believable to more people, because I do think there are a lot of people who want that exposure of what's actually going on at Eskom and are very happy he did so. But I do think there's another side of all of this where he should have stood up and said, I could have done a better job. Because why is the energy availability factor, not as high? You can't go and blame everything on the other side of the coin. You have to take some kind of accountability if the effort of trying to make your story credible is going to be taken seriously by more people. So, those are 2 examples here where we see this tussle between government and the private sector and government and the private sector. And people always say government doesn't trust the private sector. Well, the private sector doesn't trust government. And it's trying to use accountability to actually work together, I think, so that you can join forces to move forward. Now, it sounds like a pipe dream when I say that, though. And this is where I lose a bit of direction for the country, because government's interests are embedded in the interest of the ANC remaining relevant in 2024.
Yeah. And that becomes a very difficult part for individualistic planning, and for businesses to plan, and for women to plan in the country, because when you have to partner that with some of the socioeconomic inequalities that exist, Gina, the picture then becomes, right? How then do you start navigating it as a woman who's just trying to make it into this world? How do you further navigate it as Black women who have been disenfranchised from the system? How do you make it as white women who are trying to forge ahead and build an inclusive ecosystem of business and entrepreneurship? How do you then have planning and foresight and leadership that is championed in the right direction for just growing your country? It's just some of those, and taking it from some of the challenges that you've been confronted with, some of the lessons that you've had to learn along the way, both as a woman in leadership, but also as a woman in South Africa. How have you navigated that path? Because I think that becomes difficult. There's one thing to be a woman in leadership, but just a woman in South Africa adds to the pressure, adds to the feeling of loneliness in an uncertain political, economic climate, where people are just trying to make it work?
I mean, there's a lot to say there. The first thing I would state out, immediately, is that I'm a woman, which has made things more difficult. I'm a white woman, though, which means that I've also been given privilege that a lot of my colleagues and my team members have not received, being non-white, whether that be obviously Black woman, Indian woman, I mean, even foreign women, to be honest, are ostracized a lot. In South Africa, I think when we start moving into survival mode, we're so desperate to keep afloat that we can get distracted from the longer term sustainability of the workplace, of what we're trying to achieve. I mean, for this reason, I feel like I could say this till the cows come home, and I honestly don't know who I would pick. But again, look at our cabinet, and tonight we have a cabinet shuffle going on. Well, we presume so. It's been announced from the spokesperson. But again, how many women within government in leadership positions are we going to see actually move up the chain? And I'm not talking about those currently in the cabinet. I'm talking about, your younger generation coming through. We fight very hard at Citi in the private sector, and I still think the private sector in South Africa could do so much more in this respect. But we fight so hard for women to be represented correctly in the workplace. And an area where it gets so tricky is probably twofold that I tend to see from the women that I mentor a lot, the women in my network when we speak. Is number one, it's that kind of early 30-year-olds that are trying to create a family life, but have huge demands in that respect, but also trying to advance their careers, because I think it's your early 30s which are absolutely golden when it comes to pushing through. You can always be an exception and push through later on in life. But I do think those are golden years in terms of your career. And it's really difficult to do that with the added difficulty of trying to balance a family life, especially if you've got young children, etc. So that's something that, we believe globally at Citi, we do a great job with. I must say, in my SAMEA team, so some of them sit in London, some of them sit in, Hungary, they sat in Russia, Turkey, for example. What we've done is split maternity leave into maternity and paternity leave. So I've got one of my team members, a male, who is currently, his wife took the first 3 months, and yes, they have 6 months there. He's taken the next 3 months. And it's absolutely fine. I think it's actually quite surprising to people to see that it's okay if the man leaves for 3 months because nothing falls to pieces, and neither does his career. I think that's also key. You've got that job security. But again, these are things that I think we could implement in South Africa in such a better way. Sorry, now I've forgotten what my second point is. I obviously get very passionate about all of this, but I
need it.
Sorry?
I'm saying it's definitely needed. The passion is needed, but also the true, authentic, critical conversations are needed to be had. If we truly are to make a change and to see a difference as we try to go through the system of discomfort, and have foresight for an unpredictable future, which I believe it becomes so critical at this point. But I love what you were saying about how even the practical things that you guys have put in place in being able to speak to that, the maternity, paternity, how to be a woman in this regard, how to be a woman in leadership, how to have men come along for the journey, because sometimes, Gina, we tend to have conversations from a polarized perspective, and then it starts becoming a man against woman, especially in a time where the climate is uncertain.
Exactly, and we need partnership. So exactly in the same way I said that we need a partnership of such between the private sector and the public sector, we also need partnership between men and women, where we're all trying to achieve the same thing, right? So why make it more difficult and exhaust yourself by that polar opposite clash? It came to mind here that I think naturally maybe it's because the numbers aren't always equally matched in terms of male and female, especially in the financial sector, I would say. Women often take the quieter role in a team. They don't put their hand up as easily. They don't shout out as loud. They're just lacking confidence. So Maybe I'm lucky in that respect. I grew up with 3 brothers, and I learned from a very young age, if I don't shout out loud, I'm going to be dragged to cricket matches every single Saturday, and I didn't necessarily want to. But maybe that's what, something I try to teach the women in our organization and outside our organization, that I either mentor formally or there's also informal mentoring, which I love, is you don't have to have a loud voice. You don't have to be an alpha. There is so much merit given to someone who gets on with their job instead of all the hot air that could surround it. Obviously, have the confidence to speak when you need to, but at the same time, you don't need to be the person who's speaking all the time. There's actually very little value in that unless what you're speaking about is adding value back into your team, adding value to your objective. So I think there's something really important there that the workplace in South Africa could really achieve in a much better way, is maybe look at the quieter people in the room who are listening, whether they're male or female. Ask them for their perspective, rather than continually hearing the person who's interrupting, putting up their hand, or just comfortable to speak all the time.
I'd like us to speak, and I want to labor on what you were saying about the person in the room, especially when it comes to leaders. They say that we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, that we need to listen more and instead of talking more. And how then do you start advising leaders to, in their listening space and in their spaces of having to carve out a pathway for an uncertain South Africa, for an uncertain continent, for uncertain people? People are jittery and they're afraid. How then do you advise these leaders to have the foresight to see what's in the future, prepare adequately for the future, listen to what is being said more, but also listen to the political and economic climate of the time? Because the different voices sometimes get to become overwhelming, and they're overwhelming as leadership particularly.
So there are 2 things that come to mind, and these are not exclusive. I'm sure there are many others, we could brainstorm about. But the first one would be honesty. I've often had to sit down my team and say, let's put the truth on the table. Perhaps we've been through a very difficult cycle, and we know that there will be headcount reduction. And rather than skirt around issues, just be honest about the situation. Our profitability isn't doing well, or, we're under pressure to deliver something. Because with that said, if you're honest, you can also empathize more easily. Because if you're honest with the people in your team and your workplace, they will start becoming more honest with you. They will see you as human. And then you can empathize with them better, because you're probably going to hear more about the stories that is who they are, that they carry into the workplace. We so often are unaware of what people are truly going through. And especially, as you say, right now in South Africa, how concerned are we about our personal lives? And then we take those personal lives into the workplace. We start a Monday morning meeting here every week. And the first question that we take around the table is, how was your weekend? How are you? And I often start. I kind of just carried on talking this morning because I needed to get something off my chest regarding one of my kids who's finding life very challenging at the moment. And as soon as you're able to become more human, I think you become a better leader, because if you can empathize with someone else's story, you are naturally going to think about their story when you're making decisions. And just listening to someone's story, this is what Foresight is about. It's basically, what us economists try to do. We look back on past lessons. Then we try and be as realistic about where we currently are with what we know right now, and as things have worked in the past, knowing they don't always work that way, and then try plan ahead. But planning ahead is never a one-way ticket. Whether you want to choose 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, don't get too complicated there. But you've also got to have sufficient scenarios that allow you to literally roll with it. roll with the punches, be able to be adaptable. I think a lot of people forget how important that is. We talk about intelligence, IQ, and then EQ, adaptability. And I like to think that South Africans, we all think we're resilient, but that's also not a badge that I think people are expected to wear all the time. You don't have to be resilient. You're allowed to be vulnerable and admit to that, and you'd probably find more support in the workplace and a better leadership as a result of it.
I'm looking at the comments there, and as you're speaking about being authentic and true, as we're actually having this conversation, all our lights in where I'm at went off. Load shedding and power outages all combined, right? So we're having this conversation about leadership, and the whole building kind of went off, which means you have to kind of switch and save and use cell phones and use laptops because everything is down. But it speaks significantly to how we need to be agile enough to meet the needs of the time. Otherwise, we're going to drown in this water, and we're going to drown in these waves. We have to find ways of being more quicker in response to some of the problems that we're being confronted with. I want to labor a little bit and on the humanity side, and I do see some of your comments just saying, yes, I really love what you're saying about, being human first and being authentic first. So in this course of humanity, I want to labor a little bit about being a woman first. And how do you lift up other women within these spaces and within these organizations? Because sometimes, and the truth of the matter is, women are smart, equipped, and are leaders in their right, but so many of them are even afraid to put their hands up and say, pick me, or to even carve out that space or to sit at that table because they feel as though they do not belong. In fact, a lot of women suffer from imposter syndrome when they're quite able and capable of leading a dynamic, uncertain world. Just speak a little bit about that, as a woman in this business, a woman in leadership. Let's get real for a second.
Oh, absolutely real. How about this? I have massive imposter syndrome, which no one would ever guess. But I admit that to those that I mentor, and when I said that informal mentoring, I think it's such a beautiful thing. It's when you say to someone, look, I actually don't have the capacity to take you on for formal mentoring, but just keep buzzing me and we'll do coffee as often as possible. Just walk into my office and grab 10 minutes, just send something my way to have a look at. And just, I've got so many people I basically follow by example. So how do I try lift up? Well, I try and give as much of my, authentic self, but also my lived example to those that I am mentoring, again, whether that be formal or informal. But at the same time, you don't just pick on someone in the room just because they're female and say, oh, but what do you think? Thinking you're uplifting them. If they're not prepared, they're going to feel even worse. So I identify those that are more in their shell, those who aren't speaking out. I've often gone to them and said, listen, we're having a meeting. I'd like you to present something, even if it's a few minutes at the end of what you're working on. It's such an important project. Are you comfortable with that? If you're not comfortable with that, let's do it in a group email form. But let's start doing baby steps so that you start feeling more comfortable about promoting what you're working on because you're doing a really, really, really good job. And so I think it's also about reading the person. Not everyone wants to get everyone looking at them suddenly in the corner of a room and having to say something. That's really catching someone very unaware. So it's about reading the woman in the room and trying to think where you could bring out their strongest self. Yeah. And I've used that tactic before of taking someone aside and saying, listen, or even, here's another thing. We've used this in the office here where I've asked people to do almost like a buddy system. So if a female has a male that they're comfortable with, say to that person, give me more, make space for me in a meeting because, I really struggle. And this is the beauty of it all. Men are so eager to help. Men want women to feel more equal, but I think they want us to give them the tools, like how to do it. So just, you can almost empower men to help you, obviously if you feel comfortable with them, but seek out that buddy, that peer buddy who can help to push you forward.
I want to labor a little bit on the human side of you. and go into the imposter syndrome. There's so many of men and women who've been put in these positions of leadership who have to find a plan. You know, when you lead, you have to find a plan, and you have to see the storm coming before anybody else is able to pick up that there's even rainfall. And sometimes leaders lose their humanity in it, and they are afraid. How do you speak to that leader who says, Gina, you have no idea what I'm going through right now. I have to basically be a duck, paddle as vigorous as possible under the water, but I am feeling the pressure. And I'm feeling the pressure of this country. I'm feeling the pressure as a leader. I'm feeling the pressure of somebody who has to have foresight and has got the responsibility of the citizen as well as employees on my shoulder. That's a hard one to speak to, but speak to that leader who is feeling overwhelmed by the cross and the burden of leadership.
Well, the first thing you don't say is, oh, I'm sure it'll get better. The first thing you say to them is, that is hard.
Yeah.
Because how can it, at some point in your leadership path, you have to feel overwhelmed, because that's what tests you. That's the grit that, you have to be able to get through in order to learn more. So it has to be difficult. It has to be overwhelming. So I would say, again, let's pull out the empathy card here. You have to say to them, that sounds really hard. Then you can bring out some compassion. How can I help? Or if that's difficult, because I also find, even in personal life, when someone's going through something hugely traumatic, and my goodness, between COVID and inflation and social unrest, we've had a lot of trauma in this country. Not that we haven't in the past. We're trying to still get beyond that, but we're trying to repair what's in our more distant past. But now the last 3 years have been horrendous to navigate. And I find when people say, I'm going through this as a hard time, people say, oh, I'm sorry, or that's really hard. Let me know how I can help. Who actually ever says to you, yes, please, I need this, I need, if it's at home, I need some meals dropped off. No one actually says that. So if you say, how can I help, and you don't get a respond, do something. You can do something. Sometimes they'll drop a coffee on their desk. You might not be able to actively help them with their actual work struggles, but you have to be able to empathize. If they're willing to talk, sometimes just listening and having someone, because I do this all the time. I solve my own problems by talking to someone, and they actually don't give me any advice. I basically solved it by the time I've finished telling them the problem. And how can we, sometimes you've got to see the bigger picture. If you're overwhelmed, get a piece of paper. You can chuck a piece of paper away, but what are your key priorities right now in the workspace, but also in your personal life? Because believe me, you can't lead if that cup is filling over and spilling over. So, those type of actions, again, we're all in this together. And I think that's where, if you just speak to someone about that, I think it goes a really long way for someone to just stop and say, are you okay? It might energize you a little bit. You might feel safe to say to them, actually, no. Can I tell you what I'm struggling with? And then from there, you can either help more, kind of practically, or you can actually just be that open place where that person can come and speak to in a very safe way.
Awesome. That speaks to certain skills that we need to develop, and be authentic enough to say, I need to develop skills in this area. What kind of skills do we need to develop this attitude, this characteristic of foresight, of leadership, of adequate leadership, of agile leadership, of intentional leadership? Because I think that's what we also need, intentional leadership in this space. Talk to us a little bit about the skills that we can actually work on, because I believe that leaders are consistently learning.
So firstly, I think it comes from, I think a leader has to look at their self first, right? If you're stressed out as a leader, or disorganized, and I'm not saying anyone's perfectly organized, my goodness, no, you can't be if you're rolling from one day to the next, trying to adapt to everything. But you have to basically prioritize what is important to you as a leader. What kind of leader do you want to be? And what do you want at the end of all of this? At the end of your career, just more or less. You don't have to, don't hold yourself to it. But you've got to have some kind of framework as to, I guess, your purpose in this role. What is your purpose? What do you want when you eventually leave people to say you gave back? I think that's very key, because if you know that, that's the strength you're going to put into everything. So the skills that go into that, and for me, these are obviously very personal. I have to consistently stop and listen and check in. There is so much power in that, but our days get frantic and everything is important. So when you come across someone that needs to talk right now, but at the same time, for example, in my job, I've got a trading desk busy telling me they need an answer on something. What do you do about that situation? And you've got to, it's literally, Malcolm Gladwell's splicing effect. In that moment, you can say to them, can you wait 5 minutes, if that's what it's going to take to just appease the traders that are screaming at you as to what's blown out the currency or what is happening? I'm going to be with you now, but I can only focus if I get this out the way. Again, be honest. But you've got to be able to find the time, either immediately or promise to do it and follow up on it, to actually listen to those in the workplace. And when I say the workplace, it could be your team, it could be people outside of your team, it could be people in your network. But a true leader will listen first, and listen until that person is basically almost spewed it all out, so that, just let them get it off their chest. So I think listening is obviously a hugely important characteristic. What I also find is incredibly important in order to have that space and time is I have to be very good, and I'm still learning better ways to do this, but it's a combination of prioritizing, time management. Basically every day I have to sit down and kind of have two lists, and I'm still pen and paper person. I kind of just jot down everything I'm thinking about off the top of my head, right? Not in any particular order. Then I can rearrange it, and then I can check it against, kind of what my week looks like, what my day looks like in case I've forgotten something, what my inbox from yesterday looks like, etc. But if I don't do that, I'm going to drop a ball. And I'm sure this is something many people in here have heard about, but and a lot of working moms, also working parents, should I say, talk about this analogy where we're constantly juggling balls. But we have to identify which are the glass ones and which are the bouncy ones. Because inevitably in your life, you're going to drop balls. Don't drop the glass ones. Drop the bouncy ones, because you can always try catch them again.
Gina, I'm sure we could talk all day about this, but I see that the time is even 16:46, which means that we've really come to the end of it. I think more than anything else, thank you so much for being an authentic leader. Thank you for being a leader that shows up for the occasion. And thank you for being a leader that is real and is a leader for this time. I think that there's a leader for every generation, and you stand as one of those leaders for this generation. And for that, we really, truly appreciate, and for the learnings. I'm seeing that a couple of claps have actually been held, and I really do appreciate. I hope this is not the last time we're going to be able to have a conversation with you. And I think on behalf, really, of the Stellenbosch Business Institute, as well as myself, you are fantastic, you're phenomenal, and you're a leader for this generation, and you're not an imposter. You're a woman that is ready and able to lead. And thank you that the call of South Africa is upon you, and you're answering in that regard. So much appreciated.
Well, I have to say thank you right back, and thank you for the opportunity, and for all of you, thank you for giving me the space to share sometimes what I think needs to be shared. We don't always get the platform, so I do appreciate it. And as I end off every discussion nowadays, good luck.
Well, everybody, I think that this is how we can wrap this edition, of course, of our LeaderSHIFT. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. Have a fantastic rest of your day. We look forward to having and hosting you every single month. Being able to have those difficult conversations and those quality conversations about how do we gain foresight and how do we develop adequate skills that allows us to lead in a time that is needed the most. Have a fantastic rest of your Monday. More than anything else, as Gina was saying, good luck. It has been a journey, and we do appreciate you and all leaders involved as well. Happy leading. And more than anything else, know that you've got backing and you've got people behind you who are cheering you on in that regard. Have a fantastic rest of your day until we meet again next.